We're going to my secret room. You're not allowed to follow.
Greetings, Sentinels. This is Universe Unique, and today, the truth comes out. Remember that speech about peace at any cost? What if I told you the real Peacemaker from the comics would never have said that? The HBO Max series was a success, yes, but it also completely rewrote the DNA of the original character. And the most surprising part, many people never realized just how radical that transformation really is. If you enjoy deep dives into the origins, changes, and contradictions of the characters we grew up reading and now see on screen, subscribe to the channel. We're close to reaching an important milestone, and your support is what keeps this project alive. With videos like this, detailed, intense, and made for those who truly care about the Geek Universe. Now tell me in the comments, which city and country are you watching this from? I'll read every response. I want to know how far this forbidden universe Sentinel is reaching. And if this content is keeping you connected to the most relevant news and theories from the nerd universe, don't forget the triple kill. Like, comment, and share. The original Peacemaker, the one who first appeared in Charlton Comics in 1966, was a diplomat. Yes, you heard that right. A pacifist obsessed with preventing wars and finding political solutions before chaos could erupt. Christopher Smith would fly to embassies, rely on intellect rather than brute force, and even though he designed weapons, he never intended to use them. He was more mind than fist. Then came James Gunn's reboot of the DCU, and what did we see? A traumatized soldier, unstable from childhood, raised by a racist and abusive father, and guided by a helmet that literally talks to him. The series transforms the so-called Man of Peace into a borderline anti-hero who believes killing people is a legitimate way to achieve peace. This isn't just a modern adaptation, it's a surgical cut into the character's very essence. But the question no one seems to ask is, why change so drastically something that already carried such a unique premise? Because the classic Peacemaker was almost a Watchmen figure before Watchmen existed. A character built around the philosophical weight of pursuing peace in a world that only understands violence. To trade that for crude humor and barroom fights is to throw away a far richer ethical dilemma. And it doesn't stop there. Because the true breaking point in Peacemaker's story, the moment that defines whether he is a hero or just another agent of destruction, isn't about what he does. It's about who taught him to do it. In the classic comics, Christopher Smith was the son of a military officer and a scientist, a balance between discipline and intellectual curiosity. From an early age, he demonstrated genius, particularly in technology and flight engineering. His origin wasn't rooted in deep trauma, but in purpose, to develop weapons not for war, but as deterrence. For him, science was the path to prevent conflict. That ideal is what led him to become the Peacemaker, someone who literally wore the mantle of peace. But over the years, the character was reshaped by the many reboots across the DC multiverse. And with each new version, the balance between reason and trauma tilted further into darkness. In the New Earth phase, for example, Chris's father was an Austrian industrialist, a former member of a totalitarian regime, who committed suicide in front of his son on Chris's 5th birthday. That detail changes everything. This scene, which has never appeared in any live-action version, is the moment where his mind begins to fracture. From that point on, the idea of peace becomes a pathological obsession. Later, in Prime Earth, introduced after the HBO Max series, his father became even more cruel and present. A racist, a supremacist, who didn't just despise his son, but shaped him into a living weapon. Instead of teaching him the value of peace, he instilled the value of domination. This is where the advanced helmets, the brutal psychological training, and the rise of a vigilante who kills to silence voices, even those inside his own head, come into play. James Gunn's series takes this version as its foundation, but amplifies the emotional collapse. The Chris portrayed by John Cena is not a diplomat or a scientist. He's a pawn marked by guilt, rejection, and a distorted sense of justice. Instead of building rockets, he smashes through walls with his head. Instead of designing peaceful systems, he creates weapons that fracture time. And ironically, this darker, more sarcastic, emotionally broken version has now been retroactively absorbed into the comics as the canonical Peacemaker, which means the series doesn't simply adapt the comics, it rewrites them. That raises a critical question. When does a character stop being an evolution and become a total reinvention? In Peacemaker number 4, 1967, Chris looked at the sky and said, "Peace is a science we have yet to master." Today, that line would be drowned out by a joke about eagles or glam rock. That is where the contrast hits hardest. But before moving to the next point, there is one specific element of this new origin, the creation of the helmet, that reveals the true turning point. And it wasn't shown by accident. If there is one symbol that defines the Peacemaker series, it's the helmet. It appears in nearly every episode, with abilities ranging from sonic blasts to X-ray vision. More importantly, it is the direct inheritance of a father who offered not protection, but fear and control. Augie Smith, the White Dragon, doesn't exist in the original comics. He was created for the series, but he represents a recurring archetype in the modern versions of Christopher Smith, the father who turns his son into a weapon. In the comics, especially in Prime Earth, Chris's father is already a dark figure, but not a villain in armor. He is more of an emotional shadow, shaping his son through discipline and contempt. In the series, that shadow takes physical form, literally, as he continues to haunt Chris even after death. This is not just a dramatic device, it's a declaration that Gunn's Peacemaker carries his trauma actively. He talks to it, he obeys it unconsciously. He internalizes violence and tries to reframe it as justice. This is where the helmets come in. Each one has a different function, almost like technological manifestations of emotional states. The anti-gravity helmet represents escape. The heat vision helmet, rage. The invisibility helmet, denial. This is far removed from the original concept, where the helmet was just a tactical tool for communication and defense. In the 1980s comics, it was barely visually emphasized. Today, it's practically its own character. There is one scene in the series where Chris hesitates before putting on the helmet, even knowing he needs it. The camera lingers on the object, as though it carries his father's presence. And it does. Because here, the technology isn't liberation. It's an emotional prison. The helmet is the final link between Peacemaker's identity and the abuse that shaped him. In the comics, the helmets never carried that subtext. They were simply accessories. Now, they are scars. And that changes the meaning of the entire costume. Peacemaker in the series doesn't dress to inspire or represent peace. He dresses because he has been conditioned to do so. It's an emotional uniform disguised as armor. And there is one particular function, introduced quietly halfway through the season, that reveals everything, including the character's true identity conflict. But it only makes sense if you recall a specific line from episode 2. That line was not placed there by accident. In the comics, Christopher Smith is largely a solitary character. Over decades, he had no consistent allies, no iconic partnerships, and no lasting emotional bonds. In most of his appearances, he was an isolated figure, used by agencies or governments in emergencies, always disposable. That's why the Peacemaker series has such impact when it reconstructs his relationships, from scratch, starting with Eagly. The eagle that hugs Chris became one of the series' emotional symbols, but in the comics, it never existed. Eagly was created by James Gunn as a direct metaphor for Chris's emotional emptiness. He doesn't trust people, so he invests his affection in an animal that represents the idealized image of patriotism. Choosing an eagle as his companion is a clear signal of how desperately Chris clings to a nationalist identity, even as everything else falls apart. Then comes Vigilante, specifically Adrian Chase. In the comics, the original Vigilante had a serious, dark arc dealing with vengeance and morality. His connection to Peacemaker was practically non-existent. In the series, however, Vigilante is reimagined as a naive, almost childlike follower who idolizes Chris to the point of ignoring morality altogether. This not only redefines Vigilante's role, but also reframes Peacemaker as a warped, reluctant mentor, a compass for someone even more lost than himself. And then there's Keith, Chris's brother. This tragic figure, central to the series, does not exist in the comics. None of the canonical versions of Peacemaker ever had siblings. In the show, Keith represents the last trace of innocence from Chris's childhood. When that bond is destroyed, in an event caused by his father, it marks the total collapse of Chris's identity. This builds an emotional foundation absent from the comics, but one that explains the self-destructive tendencies of the current version. These invented allies and created losses are not just narrative additions. They are substitutions for the emptiness in the original material. The series reframes Peacemaker as someone who cannot function alone. He needs bonds, even distorted ones, to justify his place in the story. That's why, when he loses one of those connections, the show doesn't treat it as comic relief. It treats it as existential collapse. And among these relationships, one built quietly over 3 episodes reveals the only real chance at redemption for the character. But it ends with a sudden break, and many viewers still haven't realized what that truly means. In the comics, Peacemaker never had a recurring nemesis. Unlike Batman with the Joker, or Superman with Lex Luthor, Christopher Smith faced one-off threats, usually terrorists, corrupt governments, or war figures. The absence of a central antagonist reinforced the idea that he was more of an out-of-place piece on the geopolitical chessboard than a hero defined by arch-enemies. The series, however, needed to fill that gap by creating new villains that function as metaphors aligned with contemporary reality. White Dragon, played by Robert Patrick, is the strongest example. The character did exist in DC Comics, but he had no connection to Christopher Smith. James Gunn reworks him entirely and makes him Chris's father. The enemy becomes intimate, not just external, a threat that shapes and haunts the protagonist from childhood, carrying more emotional weight than any original comics villain. This shifts the story from political drama to family tragedy. Another example is the Butterflies, parasitic aliens that control human hosts. This concept never appeared in Peacemaker's comics. On the page, he never confronted anything resembling this kind of alien infiltration. The choice underscores the show's political satire, turning a Cold War-style conflict into a battle against parasites embedded in global government. The metaphor is clear, but it wasn't in the source material. The closest comics parallel was Peacemaker's involvement in larger DC events like Infinite Crisis and Doomsday Clock, where he remained a supporting player. In other words, positioning him as the lead against a global threat is a television invention designed to let Chris carry his own story outside the Suicide Squad's shadow. Amanda Waller is the consistent link. In both comics and series, she manipulates Chris and sends him into the field. The difference is that in the comics, Waller uses him as part of covert operations, typically indifferent to his fate. In the series, the relationship is more direct, serving as a bridge that connects Peacemaker to the broader DCU and maintains franchise cohesion. Ultimately, the show's villains are not merely invented enemies. They are narrative functions to explore traumas untouched in the comics. The father represents the origin of violence. The Butterflies represent global distrust. Waller represents a system that exploits broken individuals. There is, however, a specific mission in the comics that could have pushed the adaptation in a very different direction, but it was set aside. The reason points to why Peacemaker was never designed to carry a story alone. In the original Charlton comics, Christopher Smith was not an assassin. He believed violence should be a last resort, and even then controlled. His pursuit of peace was closer to a diplomatic ideal than a deadly obsession. Over time, especially after DC absorbed the character in the 1980s, that concept was distorted into something dangerous: peace at any cost. That's when Peacemaker shifted from exaggeration-prone diplomat to obsessed vigilante. James Gunn's series not only embraces this second version, it pushes it to the limit. John Cena's Chris openly states he would kill anyone, including innocents, if he believed it would achieve peace. The line, "I cherish peace with all my heart. I don't care how many men, women, and children I have to kill to get it," is not merely dark comedy. It distills what the character became in recent decades: a man who confuses peace with imposition and idealism with slaughter. That shift carries consequences. In the comics, Peacemaker is at one point diagnosed as bipolar, believing the spirits of his victims, and even his father, are trapped inside his helmet, haunting him. The show replaces that mystical madness with a more direct, dramatic approach. Chris is literally haunted by his father's ghost, which torments him and underscores his inability to escape the past. Violence stops being just a tool and becomes the direct expression of unresolved trauma. The result is that the series removes the remaining moral ambiguity. In the comics, there was still debate over how far a man should go in the name of peace, and whether that limit was negotiable. On TV, the answer is pre-decided. There is no limit. Chris is placed alongside anti-heroes who blur into villains, like Marvel's Punisher, or the comedian in Watchmen, who, ironically, was created as a distorted reflection of the original Peacemaker. The comparison matters. Alan Moore's Comedian was conceived as a satirical mirror of what Peacemaker represented. A man wearing the symbol of peace who enforces it through bullets. Decades later, the series brings Chris back to the same place, now as the lead. The key question remains: should the audience view him as hero, victim, or villain? That ambiguity isn't just philosophical. It frames how James Gunn's DCU intends to handle its principal characters. If the hero with peace in his name is already an anti-hero in crisis, what should we expect from the icons to come? There's also a line delivered almost as a joke in one episode that points exactly to where this construction may lead. What makes Peacemaker unusual is that, unlike most adaptations, the flow of influence has reversed. The series is redefining the comics. The Prime Earth Chris Smith, introduced after the success of The Suicide Squad and the HBO Max show, absorbed many of John Cena's elements. The toxic father dynamic, multifunction helmets, and the peace at any cost posture reflect television choices, rather than a natural continuation of comic chronology. This is relatively rare. Typically, comics serve as the primary source, with TV and film adapting what plays well on screen. Here, the process flipped. James Gunn's reinvention carried so much impact that DC aligned later versions with what already resonated with viewers. It supports the idea that today's Peacemaker is neither the idealistic 1960s ambassador nor the 1980s disturbed vigilante, but a synthesis shaped by the screen. Behind the scenes, Gunn has said he became interested in the character because of the helmet. Ridiculous, visually striking, and iconic. From there, he built an entirely different narrative blending graphic violence, uncomfortable humor, and family trauma. That unlikely mix ended up defining the definitive version, enough to feed back into the official canon. In other words, the Peacemaker now published in comics is essentially John Cena's version. This phenomenon isn't unprecedented, but is significant. In the 1990s, Harley Quinn originated in Batman, the animated series before entering the comics. Deadpool's film success likewise pushed his books to mirror Ryan Reynolds' irreverent tone. Peacemaker fits the same pattern. A secondary character finding his most memorable form off the page. The open question: how much does this feedback loop strengthen the character's mythos, and how much does it dilute the originality of the comics? If the TV version becomes the base for all future stories, Peacemaker risks losing what set him apart and becoming just another violent anti-hero among many. There's one more consequence. If Peacemaker becomes the template for the comics, he can also become the template for the new DCU. The real question: what is the cost of building an entire universe around a character who began as a parody of himself? Peacemaker was never designed to be a central DC character. He started as a supporting figure, nearly a footnote from a publisher that no longer exists, Charlton Comics. Today, ironically, he's the opening piece of a new cinematic universe. That isn't an accident. James Gunn chose to start the DCU with Peacemaker because he embodies the tone Gunn wants: flawed, damaged, cynical characters who still retain a human core that can spark empathy. The immediate question: if this new universe is built on a hero who only finds peace through violence, what kind of Justice League can emerge? Unlike classic iterations built on larger ideals, hope with Superman, justice with Batman, compassion with Wonder Woman, this starting point rests on an anti-hero in crisis. It suggests the DCU may be less about perfect icons and more about distorted versions, reflecting a more cynical, fragmented world. That choice can cut both ways. On one hand, it aligns with audiences who engage with adult narratives like The Boys or Invincible, which probe superhero contradictions. On the other, it risks losing what made DC distinctive: the mythic tone and near-legendary aura of its heroes. If everything is grounded at a purely human level, the line between Peacemaker and any other armed vigilante may blur. The series' impact on the DCU's future is clear. Gunn isn't just telling Chris Smith's story. He's establishing a rule that no hero escapes trauma and no character remains pure. If that's the foundation, what should we expect from Superman, Batman, or even Wonder Woman? The construction of icons begins already broken. The open issue is whether there will be room for reconstruction. Here's the final prompt. Does John Cena's Peacemaker still carry the spirit of the original, a belief in peace without violence, or has he become a different character who merely shares the same name and helmet? That question will echo through every step of the DCU from here on. Before we wrap up, the channel is about to hit a major milestone. If you made it this far, subscribe now. You'll ensure you don't miss upcoming deep dives into the Geek Universe, and you'll help this project grow, delivering the kind of in-depth analysis you won't find everywhere. And tell me in the comments, which city and country are you watching from? I'll read every reply because it's remarkable to see how far this community is reaching.